The questions which we ask ourselves is, how was it possible that a man like Adolf Hitler could come to power in Germany with a program like his, in which he expressed in his book Mein Kampf, that he came to power and was able to prepare for a war which ultimately became a tremendous catastrophe for Europe and for the world, and at the same time prepared the systematic industrial destruction of a whole people. This is the basic question which we are dealing with. And in order to do this, we try to avoid the traps which emerged in the wake of World War II, where sometimes Hitler was presented as being a typical example of the German mind, and that all Germans, from even some went back as far as Bismarck, some others even as far as Luther, that anti-Semitism, racialism was an inherent element of the German mind, which all those things are nonsense. We have to try to find a rational explanation based on historical facts. And the one which we will be addressing today is that such an incredible curriculum as the one of Hitler, his rise to power, but not only his rise to power, even though it had different but sometimes also equally disastrous consequences on the long run, Mussolini's rise to power in Italy, Lenin's rise to power and Stalin's rise to power in Russia or in the Soviet Union, all those unforeseeable events and developments could only take place because the normal evolution of history for Europe and for the concerned country was totally upset and put upside down through a major catastrophe, and this major catastrophe was World War I. So in other words, World War I was at the origins of this. And that is why World War I created a totally new situation in 1918, 1919, which was in no way foreseeable or comparable to the one which existed in the first half of the year 1914 before the war broke out. And that is precisely the topic of today, which we will address. I will first concentrate on Europe as such, but when I say Europe, I include the wider world. Now, the United States and Japan theoretically, not the United States theoretically, but Japan was also on paper at war, but no Japanese troops appeared in Europe, so we will leave this side simply away. But the United States did intervene, and nobody expected that this would happen in 1914, so I will include in this impact of the war also the role your countries played in the evolution of the war. Now, what usually when you speak about the result of a war, the consequences, you usually begin with the casualties. How many people, how many men died in such a war? Now, there was no precedent, there's no comparison possible between the death toll of World War I and of other wars preceding. The only, and even in terms of magnitude, it could not be compared, but the only, let's say, cautious comparison one could make in terms of mass slaughter in a war would be your Revolutionary War. That is, the United States, 1861, 1865, where, as far as I recall, the death toll went up 1 million. That was also unheard of in those days. In this case here of World War I, the death toll is estimated, because there are estimates, at about 12 million soldiers, essentially soldiers, people dying. So 90%, 95% were soldiers. Now, in World War II, the death toll was much higher, and the equivalent proportion of soldiers was lower than in in World War I, because in World War II, as the genocide committed by the Nazis, and there's also these massive destructions which occurred on the Eastern Front and which occurred also in the Far East, the casualties among the civilians was much higher than the casualties among the soldiers. Nonetheless, let me add to this that that is something one cannot overlook. First of all, as a consequence of the impact of the blockade and of the bad food supply which existed in Central Europe, essentially, in Germany, to lesser degree in France, in England, or in Italy. But nonetheless, as a consequence of this, a disease, an epidemic spread afterwards. This was referred to as the Spanish flu. And nobody knows exactly how many millions died as a consequence of this so-called Spanish flu. I just only, let's say, nearly cryptically add to this that the Spanish flu also cost the death of the mother in the Dolivoy family, which lived in Luxembourg in Bonnevoie, and ultimately this will have, we can speak about this in another surrounding, this had as a consequence that a young boy, John Dolivoy, emigrated with his father to the United States, and that he became ultimately the vice president for development, and ultimately it was thanks to him that Miami opened a center in Luxembourg. So you see, sometimes when you look over a long distance, the consequences of the war, of the flu, of this or that are, tremendous. But I leave that aside for the time being. But many more millions died in the wake as a consequence, nonetheless, of the impact of the war. In addition, there's one more element I would like to mention, and that is that in most countries, particularly in France, in Germany and in England, the elite died. That is, those individuals which had been educated at universities, which culturally speaking, had a top position in the society, they died. And when the elites die, you cannot recreate an elite in just a few years afterwards. That takes at least one generation. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that those positions which would have been occupied by the elite which died in these three countries, and in others too, in Russia too, that what they would have been in their full adult means, let's say in their 40s, in the 30s, for instance, the fact that they were not there any longer, other people moved up and took their position. You can certainly not consider Adolf Hitler to be a member of the elite. But because hundreds of thousands of students and of top intellectuals in Germany died, the same was true in France, this opened gaps so that second, third, fourth class individuals could step in and play a role they might not have played. These are consequences which you cannot even estimate properly. You can only in general terms say the death of the elite was a disaster for those countries and for Europe. There is one more thing I would like to add, and this was particularly true in England. In England, for once, the death toll of the population was very high. It was estimated that practically 1 million people died, 1 million soldiers. That was a lot when we compare to other wars where England participated. This had as a consequence in the 30s, that is 20 years later, before World War II, that a widespread movement spread in England which was called pacifism, to avoid by all means to relapse into a new war, to have a repeat of the bloodbath of World War I. By the way, in order to give you an idea about this bloodbath and about this senseless killing and slaughtering, you should travel to Verdun, which is not far away from here, an hour and a half, visit the museum and the battlefield, which gives you, the same as we will do when we travel to Auschwitz about the genocide, this gives you a direct material impression about this nonsensical slaughter which World War I was. And particularly Verdun is a page of glory, but it's also a page in the stupidity of mankind fighting for half a year with the outcome of 600,000 soldiers being killed. So, in other words, back to England, this pacifist movement had as a consequence that it encouraged the British policy of appeasement of the dictators. One tried to avoid getting into it, but the wrong way, of course. And then there's one last thing I would like to mention, which very often is not mentioned in relationship to World War I, but which I do here, because it goes far beyond the European context. The French and the British, they used in their mobilization effort not only their own natives from France and from England, they used colonial troops. In other words, they recruited soldiers in the territories which were their colonies. The British recruited soldiers in India, for instance. The French recruited soldiers in Northern Africa and in Black Africa. And they were not just a few recruits. They were hundreds of thousands. And many of those died. There were even French generals who had a reputation, when the battle was the fiercest, then they sent in the colonial troops, which were then very often wiped out. Not just the elite, but also the colonial troops died. Now, what did this have on the long run as a consequence? Well, those back home in Northern Africa, in Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, or in Black Africa, or in India, well, after all, they died for their colonial masters. So they considered that they had claims to be respected also in their own rights for a national independence or a national autonomy. So in other words, in that sense, even though the final blow in this evolution came after World War II, but also in World War I, the colonial attitude of the Europeans was seriously challenged because they used their colonial troops for their own purposes, for their own nationalist ambitions, and did not pay them back correspondingly to the sacrifices those countries made during World War I. So you see that the death toll of the sacrifices were also in terms of human lives staggering. In economic terms now, I think there is no example. As far as I know, even in World War II, things were a little bit different. There's no example where civilized nations invested in destructive purposes alone practically all the wealth they had accumulated over centuries. Which meant this was really in that regard a kind of total war. All the economies they had, all the savings which were there, all was invested in order to win this war. When I say to win the war, that is to inflict as heavy casualties as possible to the enemy. Now this had as a consequence the ruin of, if not total ruin, at least a widespread ruin among most of those who participated. The only country which escaped this last part was the United States. Also, the American casualties were, of course, not as high as the casualties among the other participants. But I do not want to develop this at length. But first of all, the currency stability was gone. You could say that over the last 100 years, there was always in international trade relations a great stability of most currencies in regards to gold, to the gold standard, or in regards to one another. And this was, of course, favorable for international trade, even though there was not yet a talk of common market, but everybody knew what to calculate upon as far as the other currency was concerned. After World War I, this currency stability was gone. Absolutely. This devaluation inflation. This made international trade extremely hazardous, if not stifled it. So that was the effect on the currency. But that was not all. Most countries borrowed money to finance a war effort. The French and the British, they borrowed money in the United States. Their debts, their American debts amounted to $10 billion. Before they borrowed this money, most investments which had been made in the States were brought back to Europe, so that the European investment in the States vanished, and the opposite will happen after World War I. Nonetheless, this debt problem will be one element for American isolationism and for trouble in the relationship between the French and the British on the one side and the United States on the other, and also with the Germans. So in other words, debts, to foreign debts. In Germany, it was even more. It was even worse, because the German government did not have these facilities. The German government could not borrow from the US, even before the United States entered. So what did the German government do? They practically tapped the savings of their own people. And they made propaganda so that whatever savings, particularly the middle class, had, would give this to the government for financing the war effort, which meant that not only were the government pockets, if I may say so, the government treasury empty, but also that of the private German citizens. All this, they had practically given their money to the government and expected that they would get their money back. But the German government, and we will see, the German government they did not have anything to pay them back. The gold was gone. So what happened was the government favored then inflation and paid their own citizens back with the money which was totally worthless. I give you one example in terms of the impact of inflation, and we come back to this. That was the most spectacular example. But inflation was rampant also in France, in England, but it was the worst in Germany. In Germany, I go now beyond the immediate after-war time of 1918, 1919. I go to 1923. In November 1923, just to give you an idea, for $1, you would have to pay 4,000 billion marks for $1. 4,000 billion marks. In other words, the German money was not even worth the paper it was printed upon. It was wiped out. And this was, of course, the worst. And this had also disastrous consequences on the country. But coming back to the economy, I come back to the currency level. It was not just the currency and the total indebtedness of the countries. And in Germany, that was particularly bad because the Germans were shouldered. Besides the debts they had to repay reparations. In other words, they had even to pay 132 billion gold marks to the allied countries against whom they had waged the war. In terms of trade now, the situation was equally disastrous because European trade was in many ways stifled and blocked. Germany was the #1 trading partner of all major European countries, not just their own allies, but even of the French and the British. That did not prevent them to go to war. Now, what did the French and the British do after the war? They imposed upon the Germans such incredible conditions in terms of paying reparations that they made a normal operation of the German state, also of the German economy, impossible. Now, what happens if your trading partner, if you are practically neutralizing your own trading partner, what will happen then to your trade with him? Well, of course, not, only disasters effects. And that is why John Maynard Keynes, by the way, you should, once you go through the corridor, why don't you just stop on the two first portraits? It is Keynes and Marx, the two antagonists, who are hanging here in in the corridor. Keynes came out with a pamphlet against the peace treaty of Versailles. He said that there had never been a more stupid, nonsensical clause than this reparation issue, because this made even the economic situation and the trading situation even worse. And when you imagine that trade had been the most important motor of creating wealth, of promoting economic development before World War I, at the end now of the war, this was absolutely disaster, because unlike what happened after World War II, there was no Marshall Plan. There was no outside economic financial help coming up, helping the Europeans back to get on their feet. Everybody was on its own. And what was true for those indebted countries will equally be true for the newly independent countries who were devastated also as a result of the war and who were in an extremely precarious situation. So in other words, economically speaking, it meant ruin, it meant decline of the economy, decline of trade. It was absolutely negative, also in economic terms. In social terms now. In social terms, as a consequence of the economic development of the last 20 years until World War I, there was an increase in terms of production, in terms of wealth in most countries, and except for France, but in England and in Germany, the material situation of the industrial workers improved markedly through the creation, in Germany this had already taken place earlier, of insurances against accident, against disease, health, retirement, and so on. In other words, my point is that those who were absolutely poor and who had no protection, social protection, by mid-19th century, before World War I, the poorer workers, proletarians, they nonetheless had a limited share of the wealth they helped through their work to create in their countries. So in other words, the revolutionary tendencies among the industrial workers had decreased. And it looked as if the upper layer of the industrial proletariat was moving, the specialist was moving slowly into the ranks of the lower middle class. So in other words, there was a lowering of the tension. And it looked as if everybody, socially speaking, was moving, at least on the mid and long run, towards an harmonious, peaceful living together. But at the end of World War I, when the governments were ruined, when the treasuries were empty, when the sacrifices which were made by the middle class, to a lesser degree by the industrial proletariat or even the poor peasants, this totally upset this peaceful evolution. On the contrary, with now the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of the war looming on the eastern part, this created now new tension, new anxieties, new fears, and new antagonisms. So in other words, this again set up the middle class against the poor masses in the cities, in the industries, and also even on the countryside, in as far as there were poor peasant classes, as in Italy. So in other words, this created greater tension and, of course, greater social instability. And when you say social instability, then there is only one step towards political instability. And that was certainly the case in Italy, to some degree in Germany, and in other countries too. So in other words, in social terms, this reproduced the old antagonism between rich and poor. And with the Bolshevik Revolution in the background, which was another threat, particularly against the middle class, that this was a threat which immediately aimed at the the economic and material basis and the status of the middle class, this spread fear among the middle class all over Europe. And the middle class reacted in the 20th century as it had already reacted in the 19th century. They were looking for somebody to help them prevent losing their social and their economic status. Even though this might imply that they would have to give up their political liberty. And this attitude on the part of the middle class first was exemplified in Italy, when they accepted Mussolini's coming to power. And then ultimately, as a result of this, they would consider Hitler as the lesser evil. Later on in the late 20s, when Hitler started his rise to power. So you see that here again, the impact of World War I was not only in political, was not only in terms of losses of human lives, in economic, it was also in social terms, and it will also be in political terms. Now, in political terms, let me say one more word about about Europe on a wider scale, and about the immediate outcome of the war. When the war started in 1914, if one looked, I do not go into details, this would take us too much time. When the war started, this was a clash of rivaling nationalisms, of arrogance, of pretensions to dominate. So in other words, the wars where you could say the real deeper reason was nationalism, this fanatical, intolerant nationalism against one another. When the war ended now, the official language, of course, was not anymore nationalism, even though the French, and to lesser degrees the British, but the French in particular, in their attitude in negotiating the peace treaties, they could not hide this kind of nationalistic and chauvinistic power thinking. But through the entry of the United States and through the presence of the American president during the peace negotiation, Wilson, it looked completely differently. It gave a totally different picture. With the American intervention, and that was also to some degree not only but due to Wilson's arguments to the American Congress and also to the American people to explain why the United States entered the European war, the war all of a sudden looked as if this were a war for democracy, a war for the implementation of self-administration, of having for the establishment of democratic institutions in those European countries where formerly authoritarian, materialistic or imperialistic powers prevailed. It was a war for the right of self-determination of nations. That is the way it was presented. And to some degree, that also looked a little bit like, as far as the Eastern European countries were concerned, as the outcome of the war. Because at the outcome of the war, a number of new countries appeared on stage which did not exist before. And already smaller countries appeared much bigger. And this was the result of the implementation of the so-called right to self-determination. This is way that Poland re-emerged, that Czechoslovakia was created, a totally new structure, that Romania came out bigger, Bulgaria was on the wrong side, so they came out smaller, Hungary and Austria also, but Serbia ultimately emerged as a country, Yugoslavia. So in other words, in most of those European countries, so-called democratic institutions were established, because it was supposed to be a victory for democracy. What happened now in reality in the years following? In the immediate years following, of all those democratic institutions in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, there was only one country where they survived, and that was Czechoslovakia. even though they had other problems. But in most other countries, very quickly, conservative, military, fascist-type dictatorships were established, so there could not be a question of a great victory, of a triumph for democracy. That was only the case on paper, and for a very short time only, immediately after 1918, 1919. So in that sense, politically speaking, the democratic institutions, or let's say the tradition of democracy, of self-determination, of liberty, ultimately came out weakened. That is why democracy, or let's say democratic liberal institutions, did not survive. They didn't survive in Italy, they will not survive in Germany. And they had great difficulties to surviving in France. They did not survive in Spain. I do not even mention the Soviet Union, and they did not survive in most Eastern European countries. The only two countries which fared smoothly and which did not have to face this kind of political, ideological problems were England and the United States. So in that regard, World War I created in Europe, on the European continent, a situation of great uncertainty, of panic, of bewilderness. People did not know anymore where to go on and had a very limited confidence in the future. What, in addition of all this, happened in the mentality of people, and particularly among the masses and even among the elite? Because so many died, particularly young people, and they did not all die as a consequence of the war. There were also many suicides which were committed during the war and at the end of the war. So this meant that after a prevailing optimistic faith in a brilliant future, which existed in around 1910, before 1914, when the war was over, deep pessimism had taken this place. There was nothing left in terms of optimism. And because simply the whole experience, it was traumatic. And you can find it even when you read the poems of a number of those who fought, some died in the trench warfare, where you have this kind of despair coming out of the literature production of eminent intellectuals of those days. Now, when we look back now on the military elements of the war, I would like to say a word, because this will be important also, on the evolution of warfare. Let's put it this way. During World War I, the least we can say that the great bulk of the commanding officers, the commanding generals, they stood out by their absolute incapacity to find an original strategy to come to a conclusion, that is to win. They all applied the same strategy of throwing into a frontal battle against the trenches of the other line, sacrificing millions of people, of soldiers, in trying to break through the enemy lines. And the scheme was the same from the beginning to the end. It ended up when the American intervention gave, numerically speaking, an edge to the Allied forces. They were more numerous than the Germans, so the Germans had to give in. But it was essentially slaughter, because it was essentially a trench warfare. And the trenches were, that is, they did dig in themselves, one facing the other, at a distance sometimes of only a few hundred meters, with barbed wires and with an in-depth new defense lines on each side. And the classical battle was artillery preparation, when hundreds of guns were shelling then the enemy lines, and then after so many hours of shelling, then came getting over the top, then came the order for the infantry to step out of the trenches and run against the other side into the machine gun fire of the enemies as far as it still survived, and it did survive. And so if there was a victory, this meant that they conquered the first trenches of the other line, but meanwhile other trenches appeared. In other words, they advanced a few hundred meters at best. But there was no breakthrough. And a visit to the battlefield of Verdun will show you that this was the case. So in other words, the generals did not make a big show. There were several examples where generals had any kind of originality and any kind of imagination to win a victory which was not the same scheme, that is, which was not based on the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of soldiers of their own army. New weapons, nonetheless, were tested and introduced, even though they did not get to know their full development in World War I, they will be developed later on. There was one one weapon which was used, that was poison gas. And so that most armies had gas masks, and this poison gas was used in a devastating way, and it was, of course, I would say, catastrophic for lungs and for the eyesight, so that those who were wounded by the poison gas, they suffered a lot. Sometimes they died miserably, or they remained handicapped for the rest of their lives. We will see that this had an effect on Hitler. But nonetheless, it was so dreadful, the use of the gas, that afterwards international arrangements, international treaties were signed which banned the use of gas during in future wars, and that was at least one commitment which Hitler did stick to. And it was not used in World War II, even though there were means of gas shells which would have had a devastating effect had they been used. The other weapon was the tanks, the armored vehicles. The British introduced them, but they did not come to play a decisive role. They will be developed and will be decisive in World War II. The other means were, of course, the airplanes. The airplanes, you must imagine that the first airplane did fly only a dozen years or slightly over, or 15 years before the war broke out. But it did not play the decisive role that it did later on in World War II. Bombing was not decisive. The fighting between rival pilots was reminding on medieval jouts between knights, in a sense. But of course, there was a future to this, and this future will be devastating, as we will see. In that sense, World War I was a testing ground, but it never came to full development, and what the French learned out of it was practically the wrong lesson, because you can never learn in one war how you should wage the next one, particularly in our days where there is a continuous development of new technology in the production of weapons of mass destruction. The French thought that they would best prepare against the future German attacks by preparing for a repeat of the Battle of Verdun, which they did win in 1916. And ultimately, this became a disaster for them in 1940, when they were caught in and behind the Maginot Line by the Germans who had surrounded this fortification line. So far for the digression of the military considerations of the war. There is one last thing I would like to mention, which sometimes is also overlooked. You know that was even true in medieval days and also on other stages. A war, particularly when this war takes place between so-called civilized nations, a war consists in one side trying to kill as many people on the other side. That is, it is an exercise in murdering a maximum of soldiers on the other side. In other words, the massive legal, not morally, but politically legal use of killing and of violence. And of course, this will have, and this did have in World War I, on the long run, a tremendous effect on the mentality, on the attitude, on the psychological balance of those who participate. Because once, and of course, this was systematically educated into the mind of the soldiers, that they should try to kill and be very effective. So what does that mean? That means at the end of the war, when peace is restored, it is difficult for those who practiced violence and this kind of killing to find a normal attitude in normal civilized life. And I think that this is even also now a problem which your government will have with those who fought in the war in Iraq. That is what the American government experienced after the Korean War, after the Vietnam War, to overlook how the veterans would find a normal situation in civilian society. This was a new experience which hit the Europeans, and particularly in Germany after World War I. Many of the former soldiers could not get accustomed to a normal life and were always prone and stimulated to use violence, physical violence against political enemies, and commit crimes. So this could not be simply overlooked as a byproduct of the war. This had an effect on the political stability, on the attitude of people after the war. And of course, individuals like Hitler, they were, of course, massively taking advantage of this attitude, of this proneness to violence. There is one more thing I would like to add, which also does not come very often clearly out of the history book. And that is what Hitler valued very highly, the use of propaganda. Propaganda was not only used by the military and did not only impress Hitler, but propaganda was on a massive scale used by all the governments towards their own population and towards their own soldiers. In other words, the French represented the Germans as the modern Huns, as barbarians, trying to move into France, to subjugate the French people, to inflict all kinds of crimes and of domination of the French people. The Germans, on their side, they represented the French, and particularly French colonial troops. There was an element of racialism, of being the last barbarians. In other words, each side gave a picture on the other as if they were the enemies as such, giving loose or making loose any kind of the lowest human instincts. And this was done in order to mobilize the civilian population, to make them bring all their sacrifices, in order to win this dreadful enemy, because nobody could imagine what the victory of the enemy would mean. So in other words, this systematic cultivation of hatred had devastating effects later on. And even when the war was over, this negative propaganda was used by the British and by the French. The British, the man who was Prime Minister was Lloyd George. He immediately dissolved Parliament when the armistice was signed and declared new elections, because he wanted to win those elections as being the winner of World War I. In France, it was Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. New elections, and again, he wanted to win. And in addition now, they added, "We will make them pay." That was one of the slogans the French used in their electoral campaign and the British used. And of course, the parties they represented, they won those elections. We shall make them pay. And there were other pictures used, like we will crack the lemon, we will press it until it cracks. In other words, they practically did, as these were democratic elections, they were responsible for having parliaments to which they were responsible as governments. These parliaments were absolutely fanatical and untreatable to make a sensible peace treaty with the enemy. How can you then all of a sudden, when you are at the negotiation table, say, well, what they would not have been able to explain it to their public opinion. After all, they denigrated, they vilified the Germans. Now, all of a sudden, at the negotiating table, they could not agree to reasonable peace. The only way they could agree upon was to push the Germans down as far as possible so that they would never get up. And of course, this is not how you negotiate a lasting peace treaty, because this was never the way peace treaties were negotiated. Of course, the peace treaties which were negotiated before, if we go back, let's say, to the Congress of Vienna, 100 years up in history, they were negotiated by princes, by emperors, by kings who had a more rational, detached way of dealing with problems. But when you have in your back a public opinion which you yourself have fanaticized, and in your back parliaments which are the expression of this political fanaticism, how can you then negotiate a peace with any kind of a chance to have the other side stick to that? So in other words, the wounds which were created by this hatred propaganda were not limited to the war itself. These wounds were festering and continued, and Hitler was systematically taking advantage of it. Now, so far for, let's say, the consequences, I would like to add two more remarks about in political terms. Because when the war came to an end and when Wilson came ultimately to Europe, he had a plan with him to set up an international organization which would prevent a repeat of this kind of a slaughter. In other words, of the League of Nations. And he had with him a state secretary, an understate secretary, by the name of Roosevelt, who accompanied him. And this will allow you to understand why FDR came up with a similar scheme on the summit meetings in World War II. But the outcome was that when the war was ultimately over and the peace treaties were signed and the League of Nations was created, when he went back to the United States, the Democrats lost control over Congress. And the isolationist tendencies prevailed, so that ultimately the country, one of the major winners who made this plan in order to prevent a repeat of the same events, did not participate, did not become a member of the organization of which it was itself the founder. And this, of course, practically ruined, from the beginning on, any serious chance to use the League of Nations as a means to preserve peace. Because the United States practiced the policy of isolationism, they did not participate, and the other European countries did not have the authority or the strength to put their weight into balance, to make decisions by the League of Nations respectable by others. That is one thing. And I think it is a very important consideration. The other thing has to do with the international situation in Central Europe. Because you see, before World War I, there were 6 European countries which had the status of great powers. You know them. Those who were represented as the Allies, to which the United States were added. France, England, and Russia. Then Germany, Austria, and Italy. They were the six who had the status of great powers. And then, of course, the United States also had this kind of status. Even Japan had, although the Japanese did not participate. The Japanese practically limited their intervention to occupy German islands in the Pacific and German territories on the Chinese mainland, which will create other problems later on. But important is that in Central Europe, there was one bloc which was represented by the Austrian Empire. The full name would be the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Kingdom, the double monarchy. Now this was a huge, I would say, central empire which included at least 10 or 12 different nations. But nonetheless, the very existence of this bloc at the center prevented at least two other major powers of those days and major powers of later to expand in this direction, because the existence of this empire prevented this. That was Germany and Russia. Germany was Austria's ally, so the Germans by themselves would not try to expand in that direction. The Russians, on the contrary, were rivals to the Austrians, and they rivaled with Austria over influence in the Balkan area. What was now the impact of World War I? The impact of World War I meant that this Austrian Empire was gone. That this huge concentration of 50 million people living in this international empire, that vanished, and in place emerged 10 small states. Now, none of these 10 states, even had they stayed together, would have been enough of a deterrent from preventing expansionist tendencies, either on the German side or on the Russian side, on the condition that the Germans and the Russians were strong enough to follow such an expansionist policy. Now, the fact is that they were not immediately after the war. Immediately after the war, Russia had undergone the Bolshevik Revolution and had lost territories and was too weak to resume an expansion, but nonetheless it had still the potential to resume it on a later day. And the Russians will do it under Stalin. After World War II. The Germans, they were the losers. They had lost. And they were, of course, weakened as a consequence of all these limitations which the Versailles Peace Treaty imposed upon them. But they still had the potential to start an expansionist drive towards Central Europe. And they had a good excuse, not only in the eyes of German extremists, but even in the eyes of the German people. Because when the peace treaties were negotiated, even though the United States, Wilson, and in its wake, the lip service came also from the French and the British, it was said that the right to self-determination of the different nationalities should be respected. And that is why those states were created. But in two instances, these rights to self-determination, or in three even, were not respected. First, Austria was practically set up as a small state with a German-speaking population, the Austrians. And the Austrians wanted to join Germany after World War I. They were forbidden. In other words, there was absolute a veto against a German-speaking population, against their will to join Germany. That was one. Two, Czechoslovakia was created as a new state. But the Czechs had amongst their population different nationalities. And one of those nationalities was 3.5 million German-speaking people. And they also wanted to join Germany. But they were forbidden. They were not allowed to join Germany. But nonetheless, they were looking towards Germany. The same as on the Austrian side, they were looking towards Germany. And the newly recreated Poland. The Poles were given territories with mixed population, particularly in Silesia. This will be, among other things, also territories we will come across when we go to Auschwitz. The Poles were in this dividing up of the territories. They were privileged and favored by the French. In other words, wherever Polish minorities were, even though there might be German majorities, the Poles were given those territories, and the German majorities were either forced to admit it or were forced to move out. So, in other words, also in some of the border areas of Poland, there were populations which looked towards Germany. So, my point is the following: the disappearance of Austria as a big power created a power vacuum in Central Europe, and this power vacuum will be used first by the Germans under Hitler, and later on, after World War II, by Stalin, to move into this power vacuum, because there was no big state to make a block against this kind of an expansion. So, in other words, the consequence of World War I, by creating this power vacuum in Central Europe, created a major area of uncertainty, of instability, inviting future expansionist aggressive countries to move in. So you see that Europe was left in a miserable situation after World War I, with all kinds of problems, political, economic, social, national. So the heritage was such that some historians would go so far as to say that one could not really speak about two world wars, between World War I and World War II and a time of peace. Some historians were tempted to call the two wars another variety of 30 Years' War. That is, of a war which began in 1914 and which ended only in 1945. With between the two military confrontations, a debatable time period where unstable peace arrangements prevailed. So, in other words, the instability was practically prepared, and in many ways, I do not say that Hitler's rise to power was a necessity, but the political instability will play a role favoring his expansionist warlike schemes which he developed in his youth and which he would put into practice once he came to power. So in other words, Europe was very badly treated at the Europeans themselves did it, of course. There was nobody else. The outcome of World War I was in every sense totally unsatisfactory. Okay, now, do you have a question? Yes.
You said that Great Britain and the U.S. were the ones in which democracy didn't waver during that time period. I just want to ask you what you thought about the Scandinavian countries.
Scandinavian countries, it was absolutely true because they did not participate at all.
Okay.
They were totally left outside. That was the same was not true in World War II, where at least two of them were immediate, or even three of them were immediately involved. And that was Denmark, Norway, and Finland, while Sweden even stayed out. So they did not participate, and Switzerland did also not participate. These were special situations. Now I turn now to Germany, and at the same time, strongly invite you to have a close look on the first chapter in Bullock and also in Davidovich, in trying to understand what the situation, and in Fast too, to see what the situation in Germany was. Now, I'll try to give you only the great headlines, because I was very, very long for Europe. For Germany, we will anyway speak about one or the other aspects afterwards. You must imagine that Germany was, before World War I, what the United States were after World War II. That is the great power around which the Western world or the Europeans clustered and which played the number one role. The Germans had taken over the French position as number one after 1871, after Bismarck's victory over France. And they developed a great strength, militarily speaking. The German army was by far the best trained and best developed and strongest. The German economy was moving up very strongly and even moving up to bypass the British economy. The British only kept the lead in trade. The United States had a development of their own and did not this directly interfere, even though they were, of course, even stronger than the British and the Germans. But this became a revelation which came out only through the American intervention in World War I. The Germans had also, in scientific terms, in technological terms, great progress was done in new inventions, new technologies. Now, the Germans were not the only ones, but nonetheless, they had a leading position. And if you check on the curricula of leading American politicians, economists, scientists, you would be surprised how many came over to Germany to study at German universities. They had really top institutions. And I give you only, as far as technologies were concerned, take Einstein, take Planck. They, after all, studied or taught at German universities. So in other words, in many ways, they were number one. And unfortunately, and that was something which even Bismarck could not foresee, they became totally imbued with this idea that they were number one. And there was a big dose of overstressed nationalism, sometimes even racialism, included in this. Ultimately, they could only be defeated. They would not have been defeated without American intervention. If the United States had not intervened, I'm not sure whether the Germans might have won, but they would not have lost the war. The British and the French alone would not have done it. So in other words, this gives you already an indication of the real strength they had. Now, after the war, they were treated as the last pariahs, as the last evildoers. When they had to sign the peace treaty in Versailles, first of all, they did not negotiate. They were not asked to bring in their expectations. No. They were simply faced with an ultimatum. You sign now, or we resume military action against you. So unlike whatever happened before, there were no negotiations. They were forced to sign, and that will be one element they considered that this was a condition. They were forced to sign under duress. They were treated with the last contempt, because when the German diplomats, when they were introduced to the conference room where they would have to sign, there was nobody to shake hands with them. There was even nobody to offer them a chair to sit down and sign. They were told, you come here and you sign. So even the formal aspect already showed the contempt in which they were held. And this is something they did not forget and not forgive. So in other words, from the top position, they fell down to the last position. This, of course, was something the German people, because after all, it was not the German people who had started the war. It was the German emperor and the German military. They had started the war, but the German people were so shocked by this treatment that they felt deeply humiliated and, of course, open for propaganda which would play on this humiliation. And Hitler will play on this. Hitler will continue to repeat, first of all, that they did not naturally and normally lose the war. That will be another thing which we will be talking about. But that they had to sign a peace treaty which was absolutely unacceptable, not only for the Nazis but also for the German people. The conditions and the formal aspect, this was something which they could not get over. Number two was that, as it happens very often when a country is defeated, the internal consequence is very often revolution. That is a change of government. Now, we know from history that if there is a revolution, if there is a change of government, the new government which takes over will always have the stigma of having signed an humiliating peace, of having accepted a loss of dignity, a loss of territory, a loss of power. And so the new regime, which was established in Germany, which was called the Weimar Republic, I will explain that to you in a moment. This new regime could not get out of this cloud of being shouldered with this humiliation. I'll give you another example. Take, for instance, after the defeat of Napoleon, when in France, the French did participate in the Congress of Vienna, and they were not treated with the contempt the Germans were in Versailles. But nonetheless, they were forced to accept conditions which, after all, were the conditions which were imposed by the winners. The British, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Germans, and the Prussians. But this had as a consequence that the regime which was established, the revolution was over, the Bourbons were brought back. In other words, it was as if now those who were in power in 1789 when the revolution broke out, that they were brought back. Now the Bourbons, Louis XVIII and Charles X, they could never get rid of this stigma, of this kind of, the French people would always say, you came back in the wagons of the Allies. Otherwise you would not have come back. Consequence, this did not last. 15 years afterwards, the Bourbons were gone. I do not say that there is an exact parallelism. The Weimar Republic was established in 1918, 1919. In 1933, that is 15 years later, it was gone. So in other words, the new regime, the democratic regime, started in a very unfavorable background, in very unfavorable condition. And of course, the nationalists, the Nazis, could always use the fact that they were forced to sign the peace. They had no other choice. There was no alternative to signing. But they were made responsible for the defeat and for the humiliating peace treaty, whereas they were responsible for none of them. But Hitler used this systematically. And so you see how difficult the new regime was when it started, being shouldered with this kind of situation. But that is not all. Practically in the weeks and months following the breakdown of the empire, the emperor abdicated and went into exile to Holland. The Dutch had remained outside the war, so he withdrew to Holland. He was gone. And nobody would ever try to bring him back, of course. But who would take now over the leadership? Who would get control over Germany? The most political parties, one way or the other, were in opposition, and as it was a revolution and everything went upside down. So there could only be one group in a position to take over. These were the socialists, the SPD, the Catholics, and the liberal parties. They represented to some degree the German civil society and were in a legitimate way in a position to claim to take over. But among the socialists, there was a split. There was an extremist wing, the communists, those who looked towards the Soviet Union, because we are in 1918, Lenin was already in power. The bulk of the socialists, they were looking towards France and towards England, towards the West. But there was a minority looking towards the Soviet Union. And so the question was, would the new German government, or the new German regime, would they follow the West or would they follow the Russians? And this was not an academic debate. This was also a revolutionary confrontation, because a civil war broke out. The communists tried to seize power by force, to repeat Lenin, as Lenin had done in 1917 in St. Petersburg, in Petrograd as it was called. They tried to do it in Berlin in January 1919, and they were crushed. They were crushed because the German army was not in shambles, as the Russian army was. And so the German army came in and crushed the communists. The same was done in Munich, where the communists also had tried to seize over. But this meant that the transition from the imperial government to a democratic government was a transition which did take place in traumatic conditions. Thousands got killed in this fighting, in Berlin as well as in Munich. So in other words, it was not a smooth transition. And it was difficult, and it already indicated that the German army will play a role also in the future. Because without army support, the moderate socialists who ultimately prevailed would not have prevailed. So they were forced to make deals with this army, to let the officers, even though the army will be reduced. But the German army became a stain in the state, and representing, of course, essentially conservative elements and not democratic elements, because the German army was the imperial army to begin with, and most of the officers remained in that spirit. So in other words, the immediate beginning of the new German state was a difficult one. Now, why was it called the Weimar Republic? Let me just explain that to you, and then I'll let you off. As the fighting had taken place in Berlin, when the new Constituent Assembly met, they did not want to meet in Berlin, because in Berlin despite of the crushing of the communists, there was still an element of revolutionary heritage left. So they chose then a place which had the reputation, and which those of you who will come along with Mr. Bacchus, this had the reputation of being the symbol of liberalism, of humanism, of the great German classics, and that was Weimar. Weimar, you write it W-E-I-M-A-R. Weimar is a small city in southern Germany, southern central Germany, where Goethe, I suppose I do not have to spell his name, and Schiller, the two great German classics, where they lived and produced their great literary works. So Weimar always stood for liberalism, for humanism, for openness, for what the German spirit produced the best. Whereas Berlin, and that is something, Berlin today has a different situation. But in those days, Berlin stood not in the first place as the capital of Germany, but as the capital of Prussia, the state which had made, under Bismarck, the German unification. And the spirit of Berlin was a spirit of authoritarianism, discipline, obedience, conservatism. So, as opposed to the Weimar spirit. So the Constituent Assembly met in Weimar and elaborated in the months following, from February till May, elaborated a constitution. And because this constitution was elaborated in Weimar, it was not only called the Weimar Constitution, but the regime which they established was called the Weimar regime, from the place where the constitution was elaborated. Do you have questions at this point? Please, I'm imploring you, begging you.
When you talked about the socialists and the split between the West and the communists, did the socialists take power in Germany before the Weimar Republic?
No, that did take place at the same time. The Socialist Party broke up in a moderate two-thirds part and in a radical, the left wing, the communists. And the left wing, the communists, they wanted to imitate Russia, Lenin. And the moderates, the bulk of the party, they wanted to establish a regime, a democratic regime, and a parliamentarian regime as it existed in Western Europe. Other questions? Okay.